Madam President.
Senator from Oregon.
Madam President, in a moment I will ask unanimous consent to withdraw this amendment. I think there's a better way to tackle this particular issue, but I'm going to use this moment to note for my colleagues that I appreciate all the senators who have come to me to say they share the outrage at the exploitative, predatory pricing of forced-place insurance on our homeowners. This drives homeowners into foreclosure, which is not good for the families, it's not good for the communities, and it's certainly not good for the U.S. government because we insure the vast bulk of these mortgages. Therefore, if you're going to be responsible from an accounting sense for the investment of the U.S. taxpayer,
the Senate will be in order.
This needs to be addressed. So, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment 2709 as modified.
Without objection?
Without objection.
Madam President.
The amendment is withdrawn.
Madam President.
Oh, the senator from New Jersey.
Very briefly, I just want to thank the senator from Oregon both for driving the issue and for working with us in a process to get to where he wants to be and where we can maximize our votes on this bill, and I appreciate your courtesy and cooperation and look forward to working with you.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided prior to a vote on amendment number 2700 offered by the senator from Nevada, Mr. Heller.
Madam President.
The senator from Nevada.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me be clear that my amendment simply clarifies existing law. I'm trying to provide some clarity that private flood insurance can be a viable option for homeowners and businesses. Private insurers are already subject to regulations in each and every state by their commissioners, insurance commissioners, and those insurance commissioners are the best regulators for ensuring proper consumer protection. So, Madam President, I ask my colleagues to support the Heller-Lee amendment so that we can provide the American public more competition, higher quality at less cost when it comes to flood insurance. Thank you, Madam President.
Madam President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, the Senate's not in order.
Senator is correct. Senate is not in order. Will senators remove their conversations from the chamber? Senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, I have to oppose the Heller amendment. This amendment would weaken consumer protections and completely remove minimum standards with respect to private flood insurance policies. In particular, the amendment strips the requirement that the private policy has to be comparable to a national flood insurance policy, meaning companies could be able to offer inadequate policies to consumers across the country without any requirements as to what's in the policy. For all of those who have talked about solvency, if you have insurance that doesn't meet a minimum standard to ensure that the consequences of flooding can be paid for by the policy, you want to vote against this amendment. I urge a no vote on the Heller amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
There you go. Any more votes? No more.
Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado. Yes. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Coates, Coburn, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heinrich, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Kirk, Lee, McCain, McConnell, Moran, Hall, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Sessions, Shelby, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Warner, Wicker. Ms. Hagan, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Baucus, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Coons, Donnelly, Durbin, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, Landrieu, Leahy, Levin, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Stabenow, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Warren, Whitehouse, Wyden. Mr. Harkin, Mr. Harkin. No. Mr. Hoven, Mr. Hoven. Aye. Mr. Bennett, Mr. Bennett. No. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Baggage, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no.
Does any senator wish to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 49, the nays are 50. The amendment is not agreed to.
Consider and lay on the table.
Without objection.
Madam President,
Senator from New Jersey.
I have 7 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority-minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that they be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate recess until 1:50 p.m. today.
Without objection. The Senate stands in recess till 1:50 p.m.
So the Senate just wrapping up amendment votes to a flood insurance bill that would delay federal insurance premium increases for up to 4 years. Lawmakers are scheduled to return at 1:50 Eastern, as you heard, and at that point they're expected to vote on final passage of the bill. Live coverage today when senators return right here on C-SPAN 2. And some news from the other side of the Capitol that another longtime Democrat